Hey Covenant, my name is Patrick Griffey, and I'm the Associate Director of Discipleship. This is Wednesday Rewind. So if you're just now joining us for the first time, this is our third week of the Wednesday Rewind. This is our time to gather together in the middle of the week to look at the sermon that we just experienced on Sunday. It could be a recap, it could be a refresh of what we talked about, or maybe I even key on something that was said during the service. This past week was Pastor Laura and Mike talking about anger. Now we are right in the middle of our series, Inside Out, talking about emotions. The first week, we looked at fear. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the topic of depression and sadness. This past week, we looked at anger. And this upcoming week, we're going to be looking at anxiety and then finishing off the series with envy. And something I was thinking about this week is how all of these emotions are closely tied to each other. Sadness can lead us to anger. Anger can lead us to fear. Anxiety, which I certainly struggle with and we'll talk about more next week, can lead to sadness or depression. All of these emotions are interrelated and connected to each other. Now, I want to tell you a little story about myself and anger, because I think it's where you can see where both Pastor Laura and Mike talk about that righteous indignation or anger, and then also that human side of anger as well. So last week, my daughter and I, we were getting ready for school, as we always do. I was cooking some pancakes, and I told her, go ahead and get dressed and get ready, and so then we can eat, we can hit the road, and get to school on time. So I've been trying to teach her some personal responsibility and say, once you get dressed, go ahead and take your clothes upstairs, put them in the laundry basket, put your hanger on top of the dryer, and then we're good to go. Now, my first clue that she did not do that was I never heard footsteps going upstairs, and I can typically hear those. But she was in her playroom a few minutes later, and I asked her if she had put her clothes up. She told me she did, and then as I was going upstairs to get something, I noticed her clothes in a pile hidden behind one of our couches in our living room. And I was immediately angry. And I think that anger was that righteous anger. She lied. That's an issue. Scripture clearly talks about that. It's one of the 10 Commandments, the big 10 ones. And Jesus obviously affirms that as well. She had broken that trust that I had with her. And then I got pretty upset. She wanted to take some bears with her in the car. I was like, no, we're having consequences. You're not taking the bears with you. And then we started just arguing. Our angers were directed toward each other in that moment of frustration. Now, I feel like I started to bring it together a little bit in the sense of when we got to school, she was still upset. But I said, look, sweetheart, what you did was wrong. But you have suffered the consequences of that. I took your bears away. We didn't get to listen to any Disney show tunes on the way to school this morning. But it's done. Your consequence has been levied. And when I pick you up after school today, we're good. The next day was great. The next morning worked out perfectly. She apologized. She clearly took her clothes by herself. I didn't even have to ask her to. And she went upstairs. Now, my frustration, my anger initially was that righteous anger. What she did by lying was wrong. But then I had to evaluate that the way I handled that was not the best because of my human anger. See, when I was younger, I lied all the time as well. I was not a very trustworthy person into my teenage years. Because of that, I know the breakage that can occur when you cannot be trusted. And I feel strongly about that. The sanctification process that Lord has taken me through has made me very cognizant of how strong and important honesty is in a relationship. And so that righteous anger initially caused me to confront my daughter. And if I can be honest with myself, the way I handled it was probably not the best because of the human anger that kicked in. I think it's interesting that fear, what we looked at in week 1, can kind of cause us to Maybe reflect inward. You talk about the fear that causes paralysis. You just kind of freeze. Sadness or depression, you kind of reflect upon that. That's more of an inner struggle that we have. Anger causes a reaction. We do something when we're angry. Now, emotions in themselves are not sinful. We've talked about that throughout this series. They're just things that we have to key in on. For me, that anger helps me recognize that, I feel strongly about honesty because of my past sins. And I want to look at an example, a passage from Scripture where Jesus experiences anger and what he does about it, because he has a call to action. So this passage is going to come from Mark 11, verses 15 through 18. And this is a scene where Jesus experiences anger and then it causes him to act. They arrived at Jerusalem. Immediately on entering the temple, Jesus started throwing out everyone who had set up shop there, buying and selling. He kicked over the tables of the bankers and the stalls of the pigeon merchants. He didn't let anyone even carry a basket through the temple. And then he taught them, quoting this text, "My house was designated a house of prayer for the nations. You've turned it into a hangout for thieves." The high priests and religion scholars heard what was going on and plotted how they might get rid of him. They panicked, for the entire crowd was carried away by his teaching. We see in the scene that Jesus is angry because the temple, the house of the Lord, his Father, has been commercialized. The priests, the teachers, the scribes, they've created a market out of where the Jews come to worship God. They're taking advantage of the people. And I think what's really interesting is that we see that the priests, the scribes, the teachers of the law, they don't take immediate action against Jesus. And we see that because Jesus' actions were justified. They knew there was nothing that they could do at that time because they knew that Jesus was right. His anger was justified. It was that righteous indignation. And so he cleared that entire temple of the commerce that was taking place, the manipulation of the people they were taken advantage of. Anger causes us to act, and it should. Anger is just an emotion, but how we respond to that is where we can get into trouble. That anger can turn into sin really quick depending on how we react. I mean, Jesus' example here points a picture of someone who is well in control of their actions and knows exactly why they're doing what they're doing. For me, I feel strongly about discipleship because I see the world outside of this place. I see where people are manipulated. I see where people are taken advantage of, where they see a false gospel that can be presented and that it taints the image of what God has given us in His Holy Scriptures. It has caused me to work at a church. It has caused me to engage myself fully in discipleship because that's what I want to leave the world. That's a legacy that I want to leave, pointing others towards Christ and their time of need. When they are experiencing fear, when they're experiencing sadness, the anxiety, or the envy, that's where my anger has led me. Now I still have my moments, like with my daughter, where I get overly upset over something. And part of that was righteous. She sinned. But then my sin came into play with how I responded. My prayer for you is at any time we experience the emotions, that we're checking ourselves and making sure that they are not causing us to sin. Remember, as we've talked about throughout this entire series, they're just warning lights. They're pointing us towards something. We've got to notice and pay attention to what those signs are. Join us this week as we continue our series on Inside Out by talking about anxiety.